Hi, I'm Jocelyn, also known as Kokopaleo, and today I'm very excited to show you my latest knit pattern that I call a raspberry basket pattern. I call it this because the pattern alternates between a simple basket weave pattern and something that's a variation on a raspberry knit, sometimes also called a popcorn knit. During this tutorial, I'll be demonstrating all the steps you need to take to make this raspberry basket scarf. However, I'll be sharing with you along the way how you could modify the pattern to make it into a blanket or Afghan. Let's get started. I recommend using a number 4 yarn for this project. I used an Impeccable Brights acrylic. It was 268 yards or 245 meters long and a medium weight. I like the narrow gauge of the KB looms, so I used their circular loom and only used the outer edge of it for this project, but a straight loom would work fine. You can also use the infinity loom that I showed you in my previous knitting video. This is the loom you will use if you're making a blanket or Afghan with this pattern. If you're making the scarf version of this project, you'll start either where the arrow shows up if you're using this round loom, or you'll start on the first peg of a straight loom. If you're using an infinity loom to make this into a blanket pattern, you'll start right here where the triangle shows up on your loom. You're going to work your way around the entire loom, almost all the way to the end. You'll actually leave these last 2 pegs empty. The loom is 198 pegs, but you'll only be using 196 of them. Casting on begins with a slip knot. Take your yarn, make a slip knot, and secure it to your very first peg. Then you'll take your working yarn and do 2 E-wraps. It begins by going behind the peg, around once, twice, and then take the bottom loop and knit over. I'll show you again. I've just finished double wrapping and knitting over the first 26 pegs, so I'll show you the end of this cast on row. This is peg number 27. And then finally, 28. To finish the cast on process, we'll now work our way back to the left by doing a simple knit over. We only wrap this end peg once, so starting now on the peg directly to the left, we grab the loop below the working yarn and knit it over. We'll do that again. Continue with this pattern all the way to the end of the row until you get to the very last peg. I'll show you what to do when we get there. I'm almost all the way back to my starting peg. I've got 2 pegs left to knit over. Then when I get to my starting peg, I'm going to do a U-wrap. We do this by bringing the working yarn behind the peg, wrapping it around, and knitting over. Both end pegs are always knit only once when we get to the end of a row in either direction. Now we're ready to start the first row. Row 1 is the first row for our basket weave pattern. We're going to take the tail and the working yarn. For the first peg beyond our starting peg, we're always going to use an E-wrap for every single row. I'll bring it behind the peg and around, then I'll knit over. Now we're going to do 4 pegs knitting over. You'll notice that I'm using the tail and working it into the pattern. This keeps it from going loose later on. Now that I've knit over the first 4 pegs after my 2 end pegs, the end and the E-wrap, which are the same for every row, U-wrap and E-wrap, then I've done my 4 knitting over. Now I'm going to do 2 with the purl stitch. I reach from above, pull the yarn away from the peg, loop under. I'm going to pull both of these strands forward, making a loop. Lift that loop off of your peg and place it on the peg. 1 more of these. Reach through, pull under, lift up, and put your purl loop on that peg. Now we'll repeat that 6 peg pattern. 4 knit over, 2 purl, 4 knit over, 2 purl, until we get to the last 2 pegs in our row. We have our last 2 purl for this row. And now we have the last 2 pegs in the row. Every single row will be the same when we get to the end. E-wrap, U-wrap. We do an E-wrap by starting behind the peg, wrapping around, pulling over. Then the U-wrap. Go behind the peg, around, knit over. This one only gets knit once. And then we have our E-wrap again, every single row, behind the peg and around. Now we're ready for row 2. Row 2 is actually exactly like row 1, except we're going the opposite direction. Remember how we had the 2 end pegs, then 4 knit, 2 purl, 4 knit, 2 purl, ending with the 2 purl? These are purling again. 2 purl, 4 knit, 2 purl, 4 knit. So the knit pegs from row 1 will be knit again for row 2. The purled pegs for row 2 are the same as the purled pegs in row 1. So these 2 are purl. Then we have 4 knit. Two purl, 4 knit. Continue this pattern of 2 purl, 4 knit, 2 purl, 4 knit until you get to the last 2 pegs. You'll notice that with the 2 border pegs on either side of this pattern and 24 pegs in between, that allows us to repeat this pattern of 6 a total of 4 times in each row. If you're doing the blanket or Afghan version of this pattern, you'll be able to repeat that pattern 32 times before you get to your 2 end pegs, the E-wrap and the U-wrap. Row 3 is identical to row 1. 4 knit over, 2 purl. 4 knit over, 2 purl. I'll get it started for you. Continue with this pattern for the rest of row 3 until you get to your 2 end pegs. I finished the last 4 knit over in row 3. I'll do my last 2 purl stitches. And then, like every row, the second to last peg is an E-wrap, going behind the peg and around, knitting over, and then a U-wrap at the end, behind the peg and around, knit over. Then another E-wrap next to our end peg, behind the peg and around, knit over. And we're ready for row 4, which is identical to row 2. So we'll have 2 purl, 4 knit, 2 purl, 4 knit, 2 purl, 4 knit, all the way until we get to our last 2 pegs in the row. I've just finished the last 2 purl pegs of row 4, so I have 4 knit pegs left. Now we have our 2 end pegs, the E-wrap, which goes behind and around, and the U-wrap, which goes behind and around the front. We can continue with our E-wrap on our second peg. And we've officially finished our first section of the basket weave. It's time to start row 5. Row 5 is very similar to row 1. The difference between the two is that for our first 4 pegs, we now purl. and the 2 pegs are a knit over. Let's see that again. 4 purls, two knit, continue this sequence of 4 purls, 2 knit, 4 purls, 2 knit, and then we'll get to our 2 end pegs. And as always, our final 2 pegs on the end are an E-wrap going behind and around, and a U-wrap going behind and in front. We start the next row with an E-wrap going behind and around, and we're ready to begin row 6. The wrapping of pegs for row 6 will be the same as row 5, just backwards. We had 4 purl, 2 knit, 4 purl, 2 knit. Now we'll have 2 knit, 4 purl, 2 knit, 4 purl, and so on to the end of the row. Now that we're to the end of row 6, we'll finish the row the same way we finish all of our rows. E-wrap behind and around, U-wrap behind and in front, and then another E-wrap behind and around. We're ready to start rows 7 and 8. Rows 7 and 8 will be the same as rows 5 and 6. So 4 purl, 2 knit, 4 purl, 2 knit, 4 purl, 2 knit, 4 purl, 2 knit, and our end pegs. And then on the way back, 2 knit, 4 purl, 2 knit, 4 purl, 2 knit, 4 purl, and so on until we get to our 2 end pegs. I've worked my way to the end of row 7 and back row 8. And these are my final 6 pegs on row 8. 2 knit over and 4 purl. We end row 8 as we end all the rows with an E-wrap and a U-wrap for our end peg. We do our E-wrap for peg 2. We are ready to begin row 9. Rows 9, 10, 11, and 12 are exactly the same as rows 1 through 4. So we move back to 4 knit, 2 purl, 4 knit, 2 purl when we're going from left to right. And then after our 2 end pegs, 2 purl, 4 knit, 2 purl, 4 knit. Starting row 9, 4 knit, 2 purl, and so on until we get to our final 2 pegs. I'm at the end of row 9. I've just done my 4 knit pegs. I'll do my 2 purls, E-wrap behind the peg and around, U-wrap behind the peg and in front, E-wrap again behind the peg and around, and I'm ready to move on with row 10, which again is 2 purl, 4 knit, 2 purl, 4 knit to the end of that row. Then remember, what we did for rows 9 and 10 will repeat for rows 11 and 12. I'm coming to the end of row 12 with my final 4 knit pegs in my 6 peg pattern. My E-wrap on peg 2, and my U-wrap on peg 1, and my E-wrap on peg 2. This is the entire basket portion of the pattern. It will repeat itself later. We're going to finish off this basket portion of our pattern by doing a simple E-wrap the entire row. You can do this one of 2 ways. Some people like to wrap one at a time and knit over. Some people like to wrap several at a time and then knit those over. And some people like to wrap the entire row. Use whatever method works best for you. Remember that the final peg is always a U-wrap, moving behind, in front, locking it in, and then we knit over the rest of our pegs. This is the end of the basket portion of our pattern, and now we're ready to prepare for the raspberry portion. Peg 2 is the same in every row. Go behind and around in an E-wrap. After this E-wrapped peg, we purl the rest of the row. Continue this for the rest of the row. When you're coming to the end of your purl row, don't forget that the second to last peg is always an E-wrap. Go behind and around, knit over, and a U-wrap behind and in front, and then an E-wrap on peg 2. Now we're ready to start our raspberry stitch.